Hello and good afternoon to the webinar this afternoon on building resilience study days, and this particular one is going to be presented by Richard from Willmott Dixon and talking about the Construction Playbook. Willmott Dixon, we are pleased to say, are one of our sponsors of the study day this year, and this is one of the webinars that has come out of that sponsorship, and we are delighted that Richard has joined us today. Just a couple of things just to make people aware. Slides will be available after the event. They will be emailed out. So if you want to take notes, feel free, but the slides will be made available. As far as questions are concerned, we think we're probably best to put them in the chat box, or if you have an issue, put them in the Q&A. We'll be looking in both of those boxes. The questions do have to be typed in. So if you can just make sure that you do that as you go along, or any observations. Anyone has any technical issues, the best thing to do is not very innovative, but actually just log out and log back in again. That tends to deal with almost all the issues, particularly if you've lost video or audio. So hopefully that won't be the case. So on to the presentation. Richard is a very experienced public speaker talking on sustainable construction, social value, skills and training, modern methods of construction, and on frameworks. With his position on a local enterprise partnership and working with politicians, councillors, council officers and the education sector, he's aware of the challenges faced in bringing forward public sector projects and seeks to bring private sector capabilities into the debate and provide positive support to enable public funded projects. I'd also like to add that Richard is one of 40 climate change commissioners working with Essex County Council to help it on its journey to a net zero carbon future. So over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. It's a very generous welcome. So hello, everyone. I'm Richard Davidson, Director at Willmott Dixon. So let's jump in, shall we? Hang on, I need to press the right button first. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Construction Playbook. Some of you may be aware of this. It was first released in December 2020. And the whole purpose of this really was about, as the government put it, was about getting projects right from the start. The sector has a bit of a history sometimes that things don't quite go right, whether that's over budget, and if we could talk about HS2 maybe, that people think is going to be miles over budget, or very late, and I'm sure we've got a number of grand projects we could talk about that. Maybe the glorious Elizabeth line, a fantastic scheme, I'm sure some of you have ridden on it, but miles over the original delivery date. But the government wants to make sure that they don't just set some rules out, they do recognise they need to work with industry. So the playbook was pulled together and was all about really getting in place the right experts from across the whole of the sector and talking about all the good practices. And to be honest, if you've read this book, most of the things in there we know about. So we talk about frameworks, we talk about early engagement, we talk about prompt payment, we talk about engaging your supply chain, your experts and risk. These are all things we recognise, and for some strange reason, we've never really put them all together. So one of the other things about this, that I met one of the report authors, and he said he felt this was the first time we had something that really had teeth. And the reason he said that is because it was originally commissioned by the Treasury. And he said, and when the Treasury asks for something to be done, it tends to happen. They are, after all, the keepers of the purse. This has been updated, as you'll spot on here on the slide. This is now the first update, the September 2022 version. I've tried to pick up the updates for those of you who already know about this, but particularly the real reason for the updates. Number one was making sure that the Building Safety Bill was incorporated into this guidance. So all of those recommendations that came through about data, about the golden thread, about being really clear on who's responsible and accountable, this is now covered. And then the second one was the framework review. I've forgotten his exact title, but Professor David Mosey, who examined all of the frameworks in the UK and made a bunch of suggestions, 24 suggestions on how we could be procuring better. And those have also been included in this. The other thing that's worth looking at, whilst this is a long document of about 80 odd pages, we're not going to go through all 80 pages. But whilst it's about 80 odd pages, they have now added this version, some guidance notes. And I thought there's a really good one, and we'll cover this later, which came from the Infrastructure Authority. And having met with some of their people, it's really interesting to see how they're trying to embody and embed best practice. to deliver greater value. So what were the objectives that were set? For context, £37 billion of public works in a year. These are the numbers from the 2020 report, but still hold about true. But there were three things they wanted the sector to really get to grips with. So firstly, building and workplace safety. I think we know that that's imperative. We need to do more. We need to take greater strides forward. The second one is around making sure that all of our policies and the way we procure items and elements are all a part of that net zero commitment that's enshrined in law by 2050. And regardless of whichever politician is inhabiting a certain number at Downing Street, that's still the law. We still got to deliver on it. And beyond certain things that have been said recently is most of our local authorities have all got commitments to deliver on their net zero carbon, and a lot of that needs to be delivered through the built environment. Then the third objective was all about social value, and particularly this was in response to COVID. This is talking about economic inequality. We could be talking about levelling up, but we could also be talking about how procurement is a force for good when done well, and learning from the mistakes of the past. Social value isn't an industry, it's a way of making sure that we buy things for the best value, including creating jobs and improving people's welfare. Okay, so what does the playbook contain? So as I said, it's a collaboration, it was a conversation, it was bringing evidence together, and there are a number of themes that come through. We got 7 themes there that were identified as being really important, and we'll cover that as we go through this presentation. So I'm not going to read them all out. You can see them there on the screen and have a look afterwards. But for me, a couple just to pick off the page. The first one here is about long-term contracting across portfolios. This is all about making sure that we have good quality relationships in place, that where there's an opportunity for better buying, where there's continual learning, where there's great improvements, we really should be looking at portfolios and not just chasing one-off projects, which don't tend to deliver the best value outcomes. And then the second one, which was really driving some of this report, is about financial assessment and preparedness for when things go wrong. And in the author's minds was the collapse of Carillion and the government never wanting to see that happening again. No one is too big to fail, but when someone big fails, it leaves a really big mess that's really hard to unpick. So this document talks about what could be done to improve financial assessments, and that goes from the largest supplier down to the smallest supplier of graphics or small elements of design. It's all about making sure that that entire supply chain for the sector is coming together and making sure that we get things right. And we'll talk about that in a bit. The other thing, there's lots of stats and numbers in this, but there are 5 stages of delivery that are outlined in this. So that as you read the document, it can feel a little bit daunting, but they've tried to chunk it down so that you can understand where you might sit in that process. So they do identify rather than using REBA stages, they talk about the 5 stages of what do I call it? 5 stages of procurement. So we talk about preparation and planning. We talk about publication. There is selection, so we might call that tendering, evaluation and award, which is again moving through those gears, and then finally contract implementation. And when they talk about implementation, they also mean post completion. So what are you going to do afterwards? How are you going to learn lessons and put that back in? So sorry, there's lots of text. There are some pictures later. But this isn't a one-way street, this document, and I think that's what's quite good about it. It's also puts the information or the onus back on us as suppliers. So whether we're a contractor, a consultant, an advisor, a small supplier, they're also making sure, saying, look, this isn't just what you're going to get from the government. What are you going to do in return? So I think what's helpful here is putting that in place. So we can go to the bottom and we could talk about the UK BIM framework. It's saying you need to start delivering on that. Prompt payment of supply chains. We all know that there have been practices in the past which are unhelpful and some might say immoral, but we certainly need to make sure that we are paying our supply chain on time. We're all being recorded on it now. We all have to declare that in the sector. And I think that's been a really good force. It's a force for good. And certainly when we engage with our supply chain, we know it makes it easier for their planning, for the retention of their staff, even for purchasing and credits. That when we pay, we expect to be paid on time, and they expect to be paid on time from us, and about making sure we mirror those payment terms as well. And I think that's if the government are going to give us something, we need to make sure we're giving back what they ask for. And then sticking with supply chain, about making sure that information flows up and down through that supply chain in the right manner. And so that means for, let's say, us as a main contractor, it means being good at managing our supply chain. It means making sure we have people and resources in place to make that happen. Okay. Why does it matter? Why will this work when other things haven't worked? And speaking to one of the report authors, he says because it's backed by the Treasury and because everything in here is in line with a policy, either an existing policy, so things around procurement notices, or an emerging policy, and that could be the Building Safety Bill, or that could be the updated Procurement Bill. So there are 14 policies that weave all the way through this document, and they make sure that what's being expected and outlined in this construction playbook have somewhere they've got a pin against them. So if it's not working, you can go back and say, well, hang on, there's a government policy in place. Why isn't this happening? So we could be talking, and where's the evidence? So number one, about commercial pipelines, we are, as Willmott Dixon, we are on a couple of national frameworks where we now start to see a bit more of the pipeline. So one of those is the Crown Commercial Services Framework, the CCS framework, probably the largest. We see the pipeline a bit more. It allows us to kind of prepare our people. It allows us to engage with our supply chain earlier. It allows us to bring a better game to the table. By having visibility, it means we can invest more in R&D. That's helpful for us, but it's also helpful for the government because it means they're going to get better returns in the marketplace. They also know that when they're procuring things, that the suppliers are investing in R&D and training. We could be talking here about harmonise, digitise and rationalise demand. That's a proper mouthful. This is particularly an area of update when we're talking about the golden thread. That's now enshrined in law. We have to deliver on those things to the Building Safety Bill. So we know the recommendations here when it says key policy 4. It's something we're going to have to do. And I think that's great because when you know what you've got to do, it's easier to deliver. So that's the first 7 key policies. Here's the remaining 7 key policies. I think the one for me that always sticks out when I read this is about resolution planning. And that's talking about what happens if it goes wrong. Is there a plan? And is that a plan that everyone's shared? So when we don't just have a risk register, but have a really clear risk and mitigation strategy. And that ties in with risk allocation number 11, the key policy there. Be prepared for the worst. And the better prepared you are, ideally, the less likely that's going to happen. Although I can't predict economic crashes. I wish I could. So I have tried to pull all of that information together, and I've got 4 key points I think we should be focusing on and discussing. So my first one is about collaboration. I think this document is really strong on asking everyone to collaborate, but giving you an idea of how to collaborate. The word is easy to say, but is it really clear how to collaborate? So I've picked up that there are 3 policy areas, pipeline, risk, resolution planning. I did say I was interested in number 14, but how does that play out? What does that look like? So if you get into the detail, lots of detail here, I'm afraid, what does it mean? So I've already talked about publishing pipelines and why we think that's a good idea. Collaboration also could be around market testing. And one of the things that we appreciate as a supplier is being able to give an assessment of what we think the marketplace is doing. So we all have periods of the year when tendering is really white hot. We're unable to cope with that. And we try to feed that back in soft market testing and saying, please don't send a tender in August. Lots of people tend to be on summer holidays. And some people listen and some people don't listen. But that's an opportunity for us to explain and say, well, if you do tender in August, you might find you don't get as many returns is that good value? If you wait until September, you should get more tender returns, and that could be better value for you. So we try to give that feedback. It's also really helpful when you're looking at some of the grand schemes. And if we took Sizewell C as an example from the Eastern region, obviously there's a lot of consultation going on. There's lots of soft market testing, but it's really important because the market isn't just the contractors, the suppliers, it's also the universities, it's also the colleges, it's also the restaurateurs, it's the hoteliers, it's a much broader marketplace. And if you don't engage, you won't know if there's capacity. So soft market testing is a really important element of collaboration. What's also important is around the contracts that we use, and making sure that those contracts are fit for purpose and that they support SMEs. And that's a really important thing to the whole investment piece for the UK, is to make sure that we are boosting not just the big players, but also engaging with the SMEs in the right way. I've highlighted that third one in yellow about early engagement with delivery partners. That's been updated for this version, and it just goes into a little bit more detail on how the government think you could do that. So they've provided a guidance note that supports this based on some of the information from the Infrastructure Delivery Agency. Again, it's really about trying to embed your key supply chain earlier and bringing them in ideally at project briefing stage to see if the innovative product you want to put in your project is actually going to be available. Is it held up in an IP problem? Is there, delivery challenges around it? It makes perfect sense to me. It should happen more frequently. So, moving past collaboration, MMC and data. This has had a reasonable overhaul. We've been talking about modern methods of construction for a long time. Have we really embodied it and embraced it in the sector? Slowly would be my view. Is there more we can do? Without doubt. And this is really trying to pick up where we could do that. There is quite a big piece in here around standardized designs and looking at borrowing ideas from the automotive industry around standard components. It's just more about your unique, but then also about digital twins and digital platforms. Here, the update is also around the golden thread from the Building Safety Act. So again, I've highlighted that. We're talking about embedding BIM and making sure that you're, when you ask for COBE, are you asking for it in the right way? Have you done the work? If you ask for a digital twin, have you spoken through what that means? And also, when you ask for it and you're provided it, are you going to use it properly? And that's a frustration for me, and I've heard this from other contractors and consultants, is we've done all this work to bring this whole digital model together, and it just goes and sits on the dusty shelf, never to be used again. And it always seems like a real shame that we've done all that work to digitize your building, to help you with your facilities management, to help you with your deconstruction activities, for it never to see the light of day. So we would ask, I think, for more people to think about a bit more clearly about how to integrate digital. The second one, it's a bit clearer this time round, is about having a clear target for MMC. So don't just say, oh, we'll tender in favour of MMC. Think about what is it you're trying to achieve, and also how would you like it to be measured? And I think the people that have got this probably the most enshrined in their framework would be the Department for Education. Their pre-manufactured value calculator is really driving some changes and some innovation. It's driving efficiencies, it's generating new value. And whilst you might not like the calculator and you might think it could be better, I think it's the right step in the right direction. So again, if you're going to start specifying MMC, think about how to measure that and what you want to do with it. I've seen too many tenders that says deliver MMC and then nothing else. You might as well not bother writing it in the tender. Okay, just 1 second. Sorry for rattling through. There's a lot of detail and data, so I'm trying hard to summarize. Okay, the third area, strengthening financial assessment. 4 policy areas. You can tell it's serious. So we're talking here around market health and capabilities. So just thinking about making sure that contracts are let profitably rather than just hoping that someone's going to deliver it for less than 1% profit. What is effective contracting, and looking at your longer term value. So we'll come to that. Payment and pricing, and I've already spoken a little bit about this. And then the last one is around financial standing. And the policy and the request is partly around not just checking them at the beginning, but checking throughout, having a strategy to do that, and making sure that people aren't overloaded or overloading the local supply chain. Okay, so just to come through some of that. So as I said here, it's about avoiding short-term thinking. There are some still unreasonable terms and conditions going into contracts, whether that's an unlimited liability or a vague scope. I'm sure we've all seen a scope in a document that says, give me something world-class or an eye-catching wow factor. That's really difficult to work out how to deliver unless you've been a lot more specific on what that means. But, and then looking at your payment mechanisms, all of the evidence in the report and was talking about, all we're really doing is we're pushing the prices lower without asking the questions why they've gone lower. And that, I believe, and I could be wrong here, but that's what I would believe was some of the challenges around some of the contracts that have been let in the past is they're just untenable and people go bust, they liquidate. A contract should be profitable. There's always a long discussion about what's an acceptable level of profit margin, and we're all talking about the energy suppliers at the moment and the energy producers as to whether they're making too much profit. I don't know what is the right level of profitability, but I know that the construction sector, certainly at the high level, is always seen, and I learned this at university, was not seen as the most glamorous or most profitable in terms of percentage returns. That said, I'm not bleating about it. I'm just, that's a note in the document. I've spoken about soft market testing. I think it's really valuable. It's brought up here in the document. It says, know your marketplace, ask your marketplace, make sure you're going to get, the best returns, the best value that way. Regular payments, support that SME supply chain, support them, you will get better returns, you'll get better value. And then the last one here was about selection of bidders on their business health. Make sure, if you are taking a broader view on your marketplace, local marketplace, make sure someone isn't just filling up the books and isn't overloading. We certainly do that with our supply chain. Maybe we have more ability to control that, but it's really important to make sure that we're recognizing if a bubble is being formed, because that's not healthy. That could be a long-term risk to you, is that it may well be the cheapest price you've received, but that's from a supplier who's overcommitted and therefore is unable to deliver. And that's really where we talk about checking financial stability, is not just at point of tender, is during the health of the project. Get a better understanding. You can probably take earlier intervention. There can be signs. Okay. So the next one is about value. This is probably taking quite some time to get some traction, I would say, this section. So policy 7 and policy 9. And I know I've spoken about this before with a couple of people I think are attending today. How do you measure value that isn't just pounds and pence? And what this document is seeking to do is to think about the outcomes you're trying to achieve. So if we stick with the school is measured on the performance of its pupils. And one of the areas that a very small area, and I know it's something that spaces have looked into before, is around CO2 buildup and making sure that pupils are awake and alert. So one of your project outcomes could be around alertness of your occupants. Difficult to measure, I appreciate. But I think that's what this document's also doing. It's challenging us to make sure that our outcomes are clearer. So an outcome for a project could be about invigorating a number of apprenticeship opportunities, or it could be about creating a relationship with a local college. And as a positive outcome from letting a contract. And it's about having a broader understanding through the entire project team, from project briefing all the way through to project delivery. It's saying, well, actually, what is this building? What is this piece of infrastructure here to do? It isn't, a school isn't there about earning money for the local authority. It's about delivering good quality services, about good quality outcomes. I know from work in the NHS that certain outcomes can be measured, or they try to measure them. When you're looking at health centres, there's quite complicated business cases, but they're trying to work out how to measure value. So there is a recommendation about using what's called a project scorecard, and particularly the value toolkit. And that was a piece of work being led on by the Construction Leadership Council and the Construction Innovation Council, I think, CLC and CIC, trying to bring together some markers and some clear identifiers to measure your value. And that's looking at that broader value assessment around sustainability, around employment, around ecology, as well as pounds and pence, and also, really importantly now, running costs. It's no good having a really cheap building that is with energy bills that are sky high. You need to strike a balance. So your project outcome could be around making sure that there is a energy cap set, a bit like maybe LETI, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, or maybe using a passive house outcomes. And then benchmarking and should cost models. This is about more robustness. I think I've got this on the next slide, but this is about more robustness around your cost models, and using different benchmarking datas, and looking more carefully at your risk allowances. So I'm afraid there's a lot of text there, which is why I sort of skipped over, but it's talked about whole life cost and including social value. The project scorecard, and there's a procurement policy note that was published a couple of years back to help you. The most advantageous tender, so that is pushing us away from just accepting the lowest price. Not to say that price isn't important, because it is, but are you asking a broader set of questions? We've talked about should cost models, and that is also trying to incorporate greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the cost of purchasing energy and the cost of building and the cost of running and maintaining. And then the last thing also is looking a bit more closely at the form of contracts we use, and asking more people to start seriously considering the framework alliancing contract, setting clearer shared objectives between the contracting parties, and measuring them and paying them on the delivery of those outcomes, rather than just, here's a bunch of stuff, go and buy it, put it together. And I think I highlighted it here, is let's spend time worrying about what the project is going to deliver, rather than some of the minutiae in the contract. The contract should be balanced for every party, but the most important thing that this sets out is deliver the contract, deliver the outcomes, rather than worrying about whether someone's put an apostrophe or comma in the wrong place. That said, I'm not a lawyer, and they might say differently. Okay. There were updates, so I tried to put the updates. I think I filtered a few through, but we'll come to the updates. Sorry, someone sent me a message. Okay. So contract management. So they've bolstered this a little bit more, about early engagement, and using the route map. So I've put up here I said IDA earlier, didn't I? I meant the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. They've got this lovely document. It's a really good document, actually. It's attached with this, what they call their route map, and identifying how to deliver best value in a contract. And they talk a lot about, as you can see there, that lovely graph, is if you want to deliver the best value from your project, then you need to get more engagement at the front end. So the more engagement, the more interaction between different parties, you will get best value. The later you leave it, the less value you can drive into your project. You don't have to relinquish control. You are asking for good advice in the right way. The second one was about the framework review. So as I said earlier, all 24 recommendations in the Mosey review are captured in the playbook. So that is around early engagement, that is around pipelines, that is around fair contracts, that is about early payments, that is about soft market testing. There's a whole panoply in there. But one of the interesting things here, and it's used both in the frameworks review and in this construction playbook, is if you're not adhering, so comply with these recommendations or explain why you're not working to best practice. That is meant to be the teeth. Whether that's being used yet is another matter, but I don't think it's far off. The next one is about digitalization, about, as I said earlier, about making sure that we have some real clear targets. Building Safety Act, all the way through here, picking up those pieces of information, making sure that we're doing it properly. One of the really good bits that I like there is there's a really good set of guidance notes to help procurement teams, and that was something that was also brought up by the Chartered Institute of Procurement Professionals, about them saying, you know, we need more help to put these contracts together. We need more understanding when we're asking to place something. You know, am I doing it in the right way? So there's some really good really helpful guidance in there around, so working with procurement teams to make sure they get the best quality advice, to make sure they can still remain independent, deliver value, but also to make sure that things are safe and appropriate. And then the last thing for me, so that the fifth thing really is about the addition of the guidance notes has to help move the construction playbook from theory to better practice. So there are 6 documents in there. I haven't read them all yet, but talking about MMC and about, you know, what does that mean? Where should you be looking? About your contracts, improving those contracts, net zero and sustainability. As you can see, I can read through those, but also some conflict avoidance clauses. It's always helpful to see those boilerplate clauses that we can start to inject into our contracts so that they are fair to everybody else. Okay, so I have a summary. There's lots of words, but what does the construction playbook give us? You've got 87, I think it is. You've got 87 pages of good quality evidence. 84, sorry. What does it say? So it is all about helping us to use best practice from inception, and we could be even talking here at policy, all the way through to operation, and when we mean the operation of the asset. If you follow the guidance, I would expect you get a better outcome. So what have we got in there? It's about making sure that our specifications are clearer, and they are outcome based rather than maybe just give me the cheapest, and about making sure that we've engaged with industry. It's about using longer term contracting. It's encouraging more authorities to work together. So whether that's maybe a police authority, with the fire and rescue services, with the NHS, with a local council, with a parish council, you've all got assets close to each other. Why are you procuring them separately? Why don't you work together? Why don't you deliver a greater cohesive plan? Standard design, we need to bring together a bit more on that one. We've talked about MMC, contracts that are equitable to all parties, and particularly around incentivizing risk reduction rather than just risk transference, and then better quality outcomes. So that could be shared apprenticeships, and we are part of that on a large scale regen scheme in East London, where between ourselves and the other main contractors, there's a shared apprenticeship scheme which is delivering better quality apprentices rather than just apprentice numbers per contract. There are still other markers in there, but it's meaning that an apprentice who needs the right level of skills that they might not be able to get on our site can go down the road for 6 months to another main contractor site to pick up the right level of training, which means that they'll have a great apprenticeship with a broader set of experiences and skills. Better financial assessments has got to be good for everybody. And the document is quite clear that says, the more time you invest up front, you are likely to go faster because you've solved more of your problems early, which means they don't come out of the woodwork later when there's too many parties involved where it's harder to unpick it. And then lastly, the Building Safety Act, making sure that's enshrined in everything you do from the beginning. And as I said there, comply or explain. I've yet to see evidence that that's being requested, but I think it is in time will come. So that is the end. So thank you. And I will stop that slide presentation, and hopefully Greg has a couple of questions. There we go. Thank you, Greg.
Hi, Richard. Thank you very much. That was really great. It gave us a great summary of what is, as I say, a fairly large document, and you managed to do that in half an hour. So hopefully we had nobody drop off, which is always a good sign. Those who joined have stayed right through. We've only got one question, and that comes from Greg Ratcliffe. And he's asked, do you think it is reasonable as a client to expect favourable payment terms are back-to-back through to the subcontractors?
Okay, so we operate on a number of, so Willmott Dixon, as a number of the main contractors, do operate within a number of frameworks. So in most of our frameworks, we are expected to have the same payment terms to our supply chain as we have from our local authority. Many of our payment terms are now, almost all of our payment terms are less than 30 days. And in some instances, we are now expected to pay in 18 days, I believe it is. If we don't pay our suppliers on time, they are the ones who are could get in trouble. So we think it's a good idea. You need to keep the cash flowing through the system. Lots of our supply chain are SMEs, and it's not quite, I don't think it's quite right to ask them to hold the can any longer than is necessary. We obviously have to make sure they do things properly, and invoicing needs to be done adequately. But the government was talking back at the end during COVID about getting the cash flowing, and that was a good way of doing it, is making sure everything was back to back. So I don't think it's unreasonable, but you can still have clauses that make sure that if something's been done incorrectly, that you don't pay for it. And I don't think, or it hasn't been done, I don't think that's unreasonable. So I hope that's answered the question, Greg.
Yeah, thanks for that, Richard. Sharon Davis says, excellent presentation, thank you. So it's just a compliment. So thank you, Sharon. Steve Rufus from Dorset Council has asked a question. Local authorities are still quite risk averse. With the current volatility in tenders, does the playbook give options for a different approach to a fixed price, perhaps shared risk?
Yes, it does. I think it leans heavily towards contracts that favour earlier risk identification. So I quite like, I know everyone does, not everyone likes it, but I quite like the NEC form of contracts. And the reason why I like it is because it makes everyone get those risks on the table up front and to work hard to identify what the value of those risks could be and what the value of the mitigation is. But then it also asks you to make sure you have identified exactly who's going to carry the risk. And then you deal with that as you go. So you flag them up with your early warning notices. Now, I know not everyone likes that because they worry that there's too much administration with it, but I think the price of administration is better than the price of the risk coming up to the surface at the last minute. The Framework Alliance and Contract, the FAC1, hasn't been used in great detail across the sector. I know there are some good examples where it's been used in civils, where you've got good quality shared outcomes, and that does again rely on you to get your risks on the table properly up front. And I think you can do that through NEC particularly well, whether that's option A, fixed price, or whether that's option C. I think it can be done, and I agree that local authorities do have a lot of risks and they do need help. And I think that's where early engagement comes from, where everyone's a bit more honest and upfront about the risks, rather than, oh, we can fix that later. It's like, well, actually, let's have the difficult conversation up front, because it's cheaper to do the conversation before going into contract than when you're on site and you've got a lot of people standing around. So yeah, I think it can be done. I think it can be done.
Okay, Greg's just come back with a comment on what you said, just to say, I was trying to think, if a client reduces their payment terms, it would be good to see the benefit to the contractor and both the subcontractors too.
Yeah.
That was on that.
Yeah, so when it does come down, so particularly the SCAPE framework we're on, they've been driving that down and down actually to get the money into the supply chain faster. So that's right.
No, cash flow is so important.
Yeah.
It really is. I haven't got to say that, have I?
No.
But I will. I don't think everybody
Fine.
still gets the importance of that. Richard Daniels from the DFEs asked, what about warranties and guarantees on performance, e.g. performance contracting? Does it cover this?
I could sit here and read it. I'll have to check. There is some stuff in there on warranties and guarantees. I think for me, practically, is we need to be clear what it is you're looking for. And I think it's a bit more honesty up front. This document spends a lot of time saying, invest your time up front, invest your time in getting it right, rather than spending money when it's gone wrong. And I think that's kind of a driving force behind it. So your warranties and guarantees can be put in place correctly. And I don't think there's any problems in there, but yeah, that's a good one. I haven't read properly on that, so I'll have to go away and read it now, won't I? So thank you. I don't remember. I've read this 3 or 4 times all the way through, and I thought I'd pick that up, but I'll look into that. Thank you.
Richard has given an example there of a 7-year parts and labour guarantee on all the M&E kit. So
yeah,
so that's an example.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that's backed up by British standards, and yeah, good quality standard warranties. I think sometimes when people ask for the cheap price, they forget to ask for the right warranty as well. So no, okay, I'm going to read that. Thank you.
Okay, and Steve Roof has just come back and said thank you for your response. So
no problem.
I think that's the last of the questions. Just to everybody, we do have to type them in on Webinar Jam. If you're wondering why you can't ask, it just doesn't work very well. So hence the reason for you being asked to type your question into the box, and then Richard can answer. So if we don't have any more questions, one comment I was going to just make, Richard, on yours, it's really interesting because it's since you presented similar presentation in Essex, but you've obviously done more work on this one because you've added things and changed, is the Building Safety Acts now in, and we had a presentation in Essex County Council from Hal Davies from SIBS. And it really, anyone who isn't aware of the Building Safety Act, my advice is to go away and make sure you understand it, because there is a clear requirement on competency, and it applies across the industry, and it's not just the high-risk buildings. One of the things that Hal was very, very, he went to great lengths to make sure everybody left the room that this Building Safety Act is not just for high-risk buildings. There's a misconception out there that people are thinking, oh, it doesn't involve us because we've not got high-risk buildings, such as domestic tower blocks and stuff like that. It applies across the competency, and being clear on your own responsibilities. Whatever your role is, that you are employing or people that are competent. It's come out of the Grenfell, sadly, but it's something that we've all got to try and understand.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Greg. And I was sat with a senior partner in a law firm about a month ago, and he said, you guys have really got to sharpen up. He said across the piece, and he wasn't just talking to me. He was talking to a minister. He was talking to supply chain and designers. He said, guys, you've really got to get this down. For us, as a really practical thing about competency, that a lot of that comes down and on site is around the right level of supervision, and if you have inadequate supervision, you could be deemed as being not competent, and that is a cost that some people will be feeling uncomfortable about having to pay for. But if we don't do it right, you don't want the circumstances anymore. So let's not talk about the building safety bill because it will go on for a few hours.
No, we won't talk about that. But
it's a big beast. But
it's a big beast. And if you don't fancy turning up in the magistrate's court, I suggest that it's definitely worth a read. Yeah. Richard is just reminding me that we're running a poll, so please let us know how you found the session. It's really important that all of you that have attended this afternoon, just let us know. It helps us develop future webinars, and it's great for Richard because it's a real difficult job presenting to a screen and not being able to see people, not being able to interact. So thank you ever so much, Richard, for your time, and there's a lot of work gone into that presentation, and we really appreciate you giving that to us today. So just to remind people that the slides that we use today will be posted out, so you will be able to get a copy of those slides and read them in your own time. And the good thing is the way Richard structured them, there's a lot of information which will get you started on the Construction Playbook. This presentation will be posted on the Spaces YouTube channel. So, if you want to go back or you want to share it with other people, please do. If anyone would like to present in the audience on any subject themselves, or any project or anything they think would be interesting to others, then please let us know. We're always looking for interesting presentations and topical stuff. So please do so. The last thing I will mention is the next presentation that we've got in our series this year is next week on the Tuesday, the 18th of October at 1 o'clock. And this is going to be presented by Patrick Brown from Edinburgh City Council. Patrick's done some really interesting work. He's a client. So, today we've got Richard, who's a contractor. Next week, Patrick, we've got a client's perspective on how they're dealing with net zero carbon, how they've approached their portfolio, what measures they'd be taking. And they've done a lot of, I would say, quite scientific work looking at different options to understand what happens if I just add a heat pump into a building and take a boiler out. What happens if I add a heat pump plus insulation plus windows, and gradually working their way along to a full passive house retrofit. And to support that, his piece of research that he did also included costs and carbon and life cycle costing. So it kind of shows what you can get for your money if you invest a lot of capital but not worried about revenue. Then you'll see that there can be big implications. He's a really good speaker again. So I urge you to come along next week. If you haven't registered already, you can do so by going on thespaces.org.uk and click on the link and register, and that'll be on Webinar Jam, say next week on Tuesday at 1 o'clock, that one. So thank you ever so much, everybody, for joining us. We really appreciate your support, and if you could just do the poll, that would be fantastic. So thank you, everyone, and have a nice afternoon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.